Thank you, Samia, for the introduction, and thanks also for this really inspiring keynote and sort of segue into this panel that we've just heard. I think that really sets us up very nicely for the conversation that we're about to have. So the SDGs are, of course, in many ways a milestone achievement on multilateral cooperation. I think at a time when we're seeing increasing pushback against global cooperation. We discussed some of that already in the course of these 3 days, at a time when we have the risk that the most powerful and the strongest risk sort of doing it their own way at the cost really of the small and the vulnerable. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals give us a narrative not just of common hope of what we can achieve together globally, but actually giving us a concrete agenda on what we can do to truly drive transformation and change. And of course, women's empowerment isn't just part of those goals, it's really at the heart of what we're trying to achieve with this agenda for change. We've seen in the course of this conference, I think very nicely, how women's empowerment is at the center of economic empowerment, addressing effectively climate change, of unleashing lasting and really inclusive innovation in our societies, from new tech to health, to green growth. I think women's empowerment can play such an important role. And so developing and scripting this approach where we have women's empowerment at the center, not as an add-on of this global agenda, will be really crucial. I think we've seen also, and it's wonderful to see so many strong women, can I just say that here in the audience and across the panels that we've had, not just on this panel. As someone who goes to so many of these conferences, it's really heartening to see this and to see this drive and this force behind women's empowerment. And yet, for all the positive stories that we have to tell and that I hope we're going to hear, there is, of course, a persistent challenge as well when it comes to sexual violence and systematic abuse and discrimination, when it comes to healthcare, what I just mentioned, when it comes to access to finance, to land, to healthcare. Women are still the most vulnerable in so many of our societies, and I think this affects us all. So one of the big challenges that we're facing is really how to more effectively mainstream women's empowerment into all of the SDGs, and in a way, maybe into all of our policy approaches. And I'm looking forward to also really hearing from all of you in the conversation that we're about to have, how we can do this. To kick us off, I'd really like to turn to Claudine first, who is Minister of State for Economic Planning here in Rwanda. And of course, Claudine, you have an important story to tell on women's empowerment. If you look at political representation, Rwanda is leading with 64% of women in parliament. You also have parity in government, in terms of government position. We've seen an array of leading women here to address us. And also when it comes to economic empowerment. So maybe to kick us off, I'd like to hear a little bit from you, your experience in Rwanda, what you can share, and also linking it a bit on to sort of how we can better mainstream some of the things that you have done.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. And thank you for just good questions. Starting by the national vision, just maybe for your information, as you know again, Rwanda's economy is expected to grow at an average GDP of 9%, and to reach this target, it requires a lot of reforms, a lot of transformations, and a number of stakeholders need to get engaged just to reach this target. And within this goal, that is under the National Strategy for Transformation and our Vision 2050, the government of Rwanda need to ensure that no one is left behind. And from that, when it comes to gender equality and empowerment, you know, we have a good number of good stories to share, because we've seen how women empowerment had enabled to reach number of targets toward this long-term vision. Starting by the process of SDG domestications, you know, after the in 2015, when the UN General Assembly adopted the SDGs, immediately the government of Rwanda started domesticating the SDGs to make sure that SDGs are really well mainstreamed and integrated into all programs, plans, from the local till the central level. And gender equality, women empowerment, same as environmental sustainability, had been one key priorities to be mainstreamed and to be monitored through all sectors of economy. Just to take you quickly on how gender equality had really been used as an instrument just to ensure sustainability, because under the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, we need to just to respond to sustainability problem questions, and gender equality as well as environment are one of the key instruments just to reach this sustainability. For Rwanda, in Rwanda, promoting the gender equality and the empowerment of women is a human right, and our constitution prohibits any discrimination based on sex as well. Rwanda's strong political will to mainstream gender into government program is underpinned by institution and political framework that show key contributor to progress and they address gender inequality as well. When it comes to the positions in government bodies, you know that from the statistics that parliamentarians right now occupy 61% in the Chamber of Deputies, and for just cabinet, we're 50% now, from a rate of 36.8% in 2014. Rwanda guarantee, again, equal right to land and prohibit any discrimination, all form of discrimination when it comes to the land. And we've seen, again, something that really produced very good results when it comes to the education. And we've been able just to eliminate gender disparity in the education. And this has related to kind of parity, where we have enrollment that has increased from primary to tertiary sector, and now we're 49%, almost 50, and 53 in secondary school, and 42.6, I'm reading number, and in tertiary school. And again, we've seen that when it comes to the financial sector, it has been seen not only in Rwanda, a number of developing countries, that women are really lagging behind when it comes to access to finance, access to credit. But in Rwanda, we've been able to create channels, policy, program, just really unable just to integrate, to involve women in accessing, financial service in each way. So financing gender equality and empowerment of women has been and remain a priority for the government. And this is materialized in by organic law on state finance that was adopted to enforce what we call the gender responsive budgeting as well. Those are some of the few examples I can share, but as we continue with discussion, we'll be able just to provide more facts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudine. Maybe to pick you up on some of these impressive figures and also some of the challenges that persist. I think you've shown us very well in terms of what we can do in terms of legislation, how the government can help in empowering women, and you've mentioned a number of issues that are still persisting in terms of access to finance and so on. One of the things that we see really across the world, I think, that limits us in making sure that the great progress that we have achieved over decades in having women empowerment on paper is persisting social norms, persisting discrimination. And so I wonder what can we do as a global community to make sure that these kind of progresses and the type of female leadership that we see at the elite level, at the representative level, really trickles down into our societies, trickles down into local government, trickles down all the way into families, where, of course, again, across the world, I think we're still seeing great challenges when it comes to domestic abuse. You mentioned on the economic front, access to finance, when it comes to really leadership in local communities. So how can we harness this achievement that you've mentioned and make sure that it gets really deeply rooted into our societies? Because, of course, we know that that's how we achieve lasting change and lasting empowerment.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, as we started by integrating, gender equality and women empowerment in all the program and plans, this needs to be sustained, this needs to be enhanced, as you mentioned. You know, maybe just learning from our country, from Rwanda, we are at a level where it will really be difficult or will take a lot of time just to go behind as well. Because we've seen situations, when you compare situation before, gender equality and women empowerment were not really integrated into the plans. And the situation after, it says a lot. No one can really think just to go back. Taking into consideration, for example, when you go to education sector, for example, you see that as women or girls, access to school, there are a number of challenges that we used just to experience in the past that were no longer there. When you go to health, we have the family planning as well. This has played a very big impact and positive impact on the family planning through the education sector as well. There are a number of things. You know, women are the most, if I can say, in our traditional society, we're really vulnerable to all decisions that were made and that excluded them. You know, when it comes to domestic works, women were the one targeted when they don't go to school, which means that any decision that comes is against them. We registered, early marriage, we registered a number of things that really were not favored women. So, which means that from the fact, from the theory perspective, it will be difficult to say how this can be enhanced. But once you have fact, I think the fact says they say a lot. So it means that maybe countries need to learn each other and to compare the situation before and the situation after. When you integrate women and when you don't really involve women in all decision making. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me maybe bring in here Jane Holl, who's currently president of SICPA, but who also, of course, looks back on a long and prominent career, including at the United Nations, where you've been special coordinator on the UN response to sexual exploitation and abuse. We've just heard it takes persistence, it takes doggedness, it takes time. You can look back on quite a number of years now dealing with these issues and on a number of different hats under which you've been dealing with them. Now, with a view sort of also to the 40th anniversary of addressing all dimensions of discrimination against women, looking back at your own experience, what would you see, where have we made the most important progress? What are the most important challenges, maybe coming back to the things that we just talked to right now in terms of trickling down into societies?
Well, thanks very much. I'm not sure I love being reminded that I have a lot of years to look back on.
You've done it all very fast.
But I do. I think of those years as I look back, the most important teacher, the teacher that had the greatest impact on me in my life is my firstborn daughter. I was a single mom for 10 years, and that's a daily exercise in inadequacy. Every day you're hanging by a thread, and the thread has a different name. You know, her illness. Will our caregiver show up? Can I get off work? But she taught me a lot of things. I remember one day we were doing her math homework, and that was pretty intense. I was trying to get her to put. It's not that intense. Galen, if you're listening to me, and I know you are. I was trying to get her to put 7 and 5 together.
You have to take the mic a bit closer.
A bit closer?
Yeah.
Samir, careful what you asked for. I was trying to get her to put 7 and 5 together. And I was sitting next to her, and she turned and faced me. And we used to call that standing in the wind. She stood in the wind, and she said to me, "Mama, if you're going to use that tone of voice, I don't need your help." Oh, my God. And I thought to myself, I better listen to her now. And I better try and see what she is seeing. And I asked her about her homework, and I said, she said, "Can I call Miriam to get the homework?" I said, "Well, why do you have to call Miriam?" She said, "I don't have to call Miriam, I can call Rebecca." It's like, okay. "Why didn't you get the homework?" And she said, "Mama, I hear with the ears I have." Oh my God. And I began to understand that we all hear with the ears we have. And that if we don't listen to 50% of the ears that are out there, what do we possibly think we're teaching ourselves? So I've spent my whole career in international peace and security and in conflict and conflict prevention and war termination and conflict resolution. And over the course of that time, there have been 4 major changing norms in the world that are, to me, extraordinary. And the first norm is the norm of inclusivity. Claudine mentioned it. Nothing about me without me. It's a very powerful norm that has emerged today. The second norm is the norm of transparency. With respect to sort of everything, it doesn't mean everybody gets to know everything about everybody's business. It sort of means is who is governing, on whose behalf, how are decisions made. So this norm of inclusivity and this norm of transparency, very powerful in the world today. The third norm that's really very powerful is the norm of reciprocity. If you're going to make me do this, are you doing this? If you don't have to do it, why do I have to do it? We want reciprocal treatment. There's a real core of egalitarianism in that, but it's a very powerful manifestation of that in reciprocity. And the final norm is the norm of accountability. When we say accountability a lot, we usually mean punishment. Who's going to get punished? That's not what I mean. When I say accountability, I say who has to answer? Who has to answer for what has happened or what has not happened? Now, these norms have not grown up in a vacuum. Their emergence and their prevalence in the world today, whether we're talking about peace and security or we're talking about the Millennium or the Sustainable Development Goals, or we're talking about the empowerment of women, have arisen and become now operative because of women. So if you ask me, what is the biggest difference the empowerment of women has made over my lifetime? It's the emergence of these 4 norms. Nothing about me without me. I have a right, and I have a right to a political say in how I'm governed. I can insist on reciprocity, and I want accountability. I want someone to answer, and it's about time.
Thank you so much for these 4 norms, which I think really sum it up very beautifully. And also I think what you've done, which I think we need to do so much more when we talk about women's empowerment, but when we talk about many of these issues, is giving a sort of personal narrative here and sort of showing how personally your life has led you to these issues. Can I pick you up on a couple of points on women, peace and security and the role in conflict and crises, which of course has been a lot of your work, certainly also touches my work a lot as well. You've made it very clear, and I think we see that and we know that including women in the resolution of crises and conflicts is key to lasting peace. And yet, when we look at some of the numbers, I mean, we have 2% of women as sort of peace negotiators. We don't have that kind of reciprocity. We don't have that representation that we need. So how do we change that? How do we get to greater inclusion in this field?
Can I tell you another story? So one day it was the end of the school year. That's important. And I said to my husband, I said, I've got to go out and get a wedding present for Miss Wilson. And my husband said, who's Miss Wilson? You know, I mean, who is that? I said, it's Cameron's teacher. She's getting married next week, and she and her husband are moving to Hawaii, and she's trying to sell her car, and she was looking for some dishware. And my husband said, how do you know all this? And I said, because women have many more actors in their plays, and men have scenery. Miss Wilson was a piece of scenery in my husband's life. And I've told this story on him before. He tells stories on me. But I was really struck by that. And I mean, it's a gross, unfair generalization, but men have scenery. And women have actors and players that are animated participants in these dramas we call our lives. And whether or not we're engaged in a peace negotiation, or whether or not we're in our villages or in our towns or in our parent-teacher associations, we believe very deeply in the animated human beings that we are engaging with. And it's absolutely, if I could change one thing, I would take the scenery off the stage and ask men to focus on the actors. I mean, doesn't it strike you at all odd when you go into a room and you see a panel and and this is the phrase I use, middle-aged white men? What do you possibly think you're teaching each other about reproductive rights? And that's unfair, I know, to a certain extent, but I'll just be a little unfair, because I feel like there's a lot of us who feel as though things have been unfair for a long time, and the only way to get heard is to point out the reciprocity that exists in both our empowerment and in our disempowerment.
Great, thanks. Maybe that's a wonderful segue to turn to a middle-aged white man with no friends.
I'm in love with one, by the way.
Who's the Director General for International Development in Sweden at the Swedish Foreign Ministries, which is, of course, a country, and a country with many men also, who haven't just focused on the scenery, but who have really made women and women's activeness the center of their foreign policy. You're the first country that has openly and strongly advocated for a feminist foreign policy. Sorry, can you still hear me? So I think Sweden has been a wonderful partner for us in the European Union in really making women's empowerment at the heart of many of our global engagements, but also at home, of course, in our own societies in Europe. And I'd really like to hear from you as a country that has mainstreamed the issue of women and women's empowerment into their foreign policy. What are the lessons that you take when taking this to the global level, and what can we do more effectively to make sure that this is not a side issue, that this is not scenery, as Jane has said, or the last sort of box-ticking exercise, but really at the core of what we're doing?
Well, thank you. I'm well aware that I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm also well aware that... Closer, okay. I'm also well aware that you know, I'm also from a country as far north as you can get. Above us is ice. So when you ask me, you know, what lessons can we teach, I'm aware of, you know, not wanting to be prescriptive in any way. And I think this is a joint exercise. I mean, we're in Rwanda, which is in many ways leading on gender equality. And so it's an important conversation that we're having rather than us trying to teach examples. But having said that, it's true that we have for a long time had a lot of focus on gender equality. And I think, I mean, the starting point for that, you've mentioned some of the positive statistics that you can show here. It's very, very easy to bring out the negative statistics. You were talking about peace and security. I saw numbers on, you know, on the 32 major peace agreements between 92 and 2011. They were to 96% signed by men. If you know, and we can go on with this. Fewer women who own mobile phones and so on, and participation in the labor force. And of course, in a way that also offers an opportunity for change and releasing economic potential in greater participation in the labor force and so on. So what we've tried to do in our feminist foreign policy, as you pointed out, is to frame this in an analytic framework where we have emphasized rights, representation, and resources. And we have been very careful to not make one of those a priority above any of the other. I think, of course, the question of representation is very key. The success and the gains that we are seeing in terms of women representation in parliament and so on is very impressive, very important. But it has to be also coupled with the questions around resources and rights, and as you were mentioning, we are also including that. I mean, doing gender budgeting, which we have been doing for a long time. We do that in our development policy. So it's a question of analytically trying to understand what choices we make and how we do that. Someone will correct me, but I think in our own national experience, one of the most significant gender equality policies that was taken when I grew up, or when I was born, was the introduction of quality and low-cost childcare. Allowed my mother to go to work instead of having to stay home with me, and that's a choice. That's an analytical choice if you do that, or if you invest more in the railroads, or it's a costly reform. It's a costly economic task to take that on, and you make that choice. Our railroads now, by the way, are pretty bad. But there are more women participation in the labor force, and I think that kind of sort of, you need that framework, and you need to push it and be consistent in doing that.
Maybe just to follow up on a couple of those things. I think first of all, on the lessons, I hope our conversation here and also our global conversation is very much about the lessons that we learn together and not the lessons that we teach so much. And I think that is so key to the SDGs, and I think that is crucial to the conversation that we're having about women's empowerment. And I think all of your interventions have already shown that. Claudine mentioned at the beginning a crucial point that's also at the heart of the SDGs, of course, is that women's rights are also human rights. And really lasting progress on women's empowerment can only happen in a context of lasting progress and deep transformation in terms of human rights. And yet, as I stressed already at the outset, we are living through a time when we're seeing quite important pushback against that. We're seeing pushback across the space for civil society. We're seeing pushback in the work that we're doing globally on human rights, where the conversation is again shifting towards power and interests, and where human rights are seen more and more as a sort of add-on. So how can we make sure that the conversation that we're having on women's empowerment is really deeply rooted in that lasting progress on human rights? And again, what can we do globally to make sure that this remains at the heart of what we're doing?
I think that what you're bringing out is it's touching on what values we have and how possible it is to have the difficult conversations. For us, a top priority, of course, has been sexual and reproductive health and rights. That's a top priority in our development policy. It's a top priority in our foreign policy interventions. It is indeed a very, very difficult discussion, and I'm not going to put you on the spot and say if that's what you're referring to, but it's a good example of where a coalition of resistance to progress that has been made in the past is now forming, with some, including some surprising coalitions, I would say. It's a very challenging discussion. But again, I think we need, in order to make progress, we need to connect that to, and you don't have to, we choose the choice to frame it in rights, representation, and resources, and there can be other analytical frameworks. But if you take an issue like SRHR, I fully agree with you that if we have middle-aged white men discussing it, it's not sure that we are going to make progress. So you know, and if we have to put the resources in there to make progress on that area, but we also have to have the right representation in the discussion on that. I'm not always sure that's what's happening in some of the UN conferences and so on where we all are participating. So it's, that would be my offer of sort of be very holistic in that discussion.
I want to bring in Daria, Daria Illy, who's the director of coffee culture at Illy Café. Daria, throughout the 3 days, I think we've discussed in so many parts the crucial role that the private sector also plays in driving change and in ensuring that change is lasting and trickles down into our societies. Now, you at Illy Café have I think, shown in many ways how empowering women can help towards a more ethical way of doing business. I think you've been elected sort of one of the most ethical enterprises. But of course, also what is crucial, and I think what is something that we need to stress, what we've stressed in terms of women's empowerment for peace and security, that things are more effective, they're more lasting when we have women as part of that. And I think we see that, of course, in the economy. Economies perform much better when women are part of the workforce. Business perform much better. They make more money when they employ women and when they give a rightful place to women. So I think this is both a sort of values and ethical concern, but it also makes business sense. And I think that's something that we shouldn't stop stressing as well, that it actually gets us to effective solutions. And I think the SDGs are so much about getting results on the ground. So can you tell us a little bit more about the private sector? I mean, from your experience, but also more broadly, how do we make sure that this is something that the private sector can be part of that conversation? How can you be a sort of productive and constructive part of this conversation?
Thanks. I have a silly story to tell you before I answer directly. I have a silly story to share too. I've been asked this question by a journalist, and he asks, so it was something on career and women leadership and our everyday agenda and how to balance work and family. And he says, so what is the most feminine thing you put into your job? And I felt really silly because I said, so what's my answer now? And I thought, maybe high heels sometimes? And then I think, well, but nowadays, not only, I mean, it happens that we all wear heels. I mean, you can't say man or women sometimes. I mean, I don't know how to say this. So then the PR close to me, the person, she suggests sensitivity. And I say, well, why is this not man sensitive? So I cut the question out of the interview, but it's okay. I'm still looking for the answer. So coming to your question, most of our investment, as far as Illy Café, and I see that many in the private sector are doing it as well, directly impacts SDG on gender equality and also the one on a better education. So if we think of the way that we can spread and be generous and inclusive, one of this is definitely the support that we give on information and education. This is circular. You cannot have a responsible business and grow without thinking of next generations and how to have a social and economic and environmental positive impact. So we have 27 seats of University of Coffee around the world. We work directly with growers, with consumers, coffee lovers, and also with professionals. Now, the more we do on education, the more we can impact the SDGs that I was mentioning.
I think the education, the role of education is of course crucial, and it's great for you to mention that. I'm glad there's such booming support for women's empowerment, including from the microphones, but I hope we can kind of limit the booming until the end, maybe. One of the things we already talked about is also in terms of rooting this change in societies, and education, of course, one way. Another way we've been discussing is access to finance, a sort of seed financing, which I know in Rwanda plays a crucial role, but I think all of you, from your perspective, you can speak to that, how that remains a challenge in so many countries. So what can the private sector do there to really make sure that we improve the situation? That sometimes it's small finance that's needed to make a massive change, but the question is really to spread it broadly and not to have a number of beautiful key stories that we tell and key initiatives. So what can we, again, picking up on this issue of mainstreaming, which is part of this panel, what can we do to have a much broader, more effective mainstream strategy towards providing effective financing for women's empowerment?
Again, it starts from education, meaning that some of the growers, and we know that 70% of the workforce in the world of coffee is made by women, they sometimes they're not experts of how to manage a finca or a fazenda. So if we do the knowledge transfer, and this also comes to how to manage, how the economics, what's the productivity, which fertilizers should we be using in order to have a higher quality product, because a higher quality product means a better margin for them. And in the end, we talk a lot about microcredit, and I think that part of the things that we can do in the private sector is helping them to get that access in a very ethical way. Have I answered?
I saw many of you nodding on the sort of topic of education. So, Johannes, do you maybe want to come in on that? And also Claudine and Jane?
Sure. I mean, from a representative who works with development cooperation, of course we have. I mean, we have some tools available in that we have finance that we can provide and that we can target to specific groups. But in the long term, what your perspective, what the business does, and how that that's the long-term effect, of course. So, but I think we can. We can be a bit more risk-taking in a way, and in a way show the possibilities, and that we try to do, and be a bit more. Well, I don't want to say more because I'm sure you're doing your very best as well, but that's a role that we can play with grant money. Really, so.
Do you want to come in, either of you, Jane, Claudine?
Yeah, just when it comes to the finance, I really believe that increasing opportunity for women to access financial services and strengthen women employability will just really improve women's role in the socio-economic transformation. This is what I have to say. Thank you.
I'm still struggling actually with one of Daria's questions. One of the instincts that women have that I've noticed in my career is that they try and help each other. And I'm trying to help you with this question of, what part of your work is more feminine? I can't help you. I won't be able to help you. I think though that how do we mainstream this? How many young women in this room are in their 30s? Show us. How many of you are in your 20s? That's how we mainstream.
Yeah, and I think with that, I'd love to turn to the room. I already stressed at the outset, I think it's great that we have also a young audience here. We have a lot of expertise on many of these issues. Again, I mean, women's issues are really at the heart of all of these things. We have a lot of expertise in the room on new technologies, on innovation, on AI, on climate change, on health.